Hey, Dave Etchells here from Imaging Resource. I'm here at Fujikina in Tokyo, where Fujifilm has just announced their GFX-100. This is a 100 megapixel medium format camera. They actually had pre-announced it previously, but today we learned all of the full details about it when it's shipping, and we actually have some hands-on samples. So I'm just going to dive right in and start talking about the sensor, and we'll go from there. So the GFX-100 sensor isn't just another 100 megapixel medium format sensor, it's also the first back illuminated sensor that size we've seen in a camera to date, and it also uses copper wiring to increase readout speed and reduce power. BSI means that Fujifilm has managed to actually deliver slightly better noise performance than the 50S or 50R, even with the smaller pixels, and it also has the same 14-step dynamic range. Taking advantage of the exceptional dynamic range, the GFX 100 can also save 16-bit raw data in single shot mode, but you can also choose 14 bits if you want to save space, and 14 bits is also the limit for continuous shooting. And again, if you want to save space and don't need the full 100 megapixel resolution, there's also an M mode that records files just like the ones from the 50S or R. And here's a treat, the latest Lightroom and Photoshop versions will read GFX 100 raw files directly, so you can follow the link below to our website to download some raw files to play with. The other really big news about this camera is it's the first medium format body with in-body image stabilization, or IBIS for short. This is a pretty huge accomplishment because the sensor is not only so much larger than a full-frame one, but with 100 megapixels it means they have to keep things extra steady to maintain that resolution. I mean, if you think about it, you need a good half-stop better stabilization when you double the resolution of its sensor to keep the same level of blur. And it's not just the sensor that's bigger, the whole assembly weighs about twice what a full-frame IBIS system does, and it's 4 times heavier than ones in APS-C cameras like Fuji's XH1. So there's a lot of mass to move around, and they have to keep things really, really steady to not lose the resolution. But there's another challenge too, and that's how precise the alignment has to be to keep the entire sensor perfectly in focus. Fuji told us that the factory has to assemble the IBIS systems to an alignment tolerance of just 20 microns, relative to the lens mount. That's just 0.02 of a millimeter across the entire 53 millimeter corner-to-corner distance. I mean, it's one thing to align a sensor to a lens mount just by itself, but it's much harder to keep a moving assembly like this in perfect alignment. So the whole moving assembly, the sensor carrier, the little ceramic bearing balls, etc., all have to be held to that same 20 micron tolerance. It's really quite impressive. And this is also a 5-axis IS system, so it can compensate for roll, rotation of the camera body, which is something you can't do optically, as well as up and down, side to side, and tilting motions. And finally, the GFX 100's IBIS gives you 5.5 stops of stabilization. Now, of course, your mileage may vary depending on how steadily you can hold the camera in the first place, and it'll vary depending on the lens that's attached. But the bottom line is you actually can hand-hold a 100 megapixel camera now, even in lower light, rather than needing to keep it locked down on a tripod. Now, one additional note about this, at least at present, our understanding is that the GFX 100's IBIS does not work in cooperation with the current optically stabilized lenses. So you need to either turn off the IS in the lens or turn off the IS in the body when using the two of them together. Now, this could change with future firmware update, the way Fuji did with the XH1, but there's no word on that currently as to when or even if it'll happen. The other really big news here is this is not just a stills camera, it's really a full-fledged video camera as well. Really, the easiest way to think about the GFX 100's video capabilities is that it's basically a medium format X-T3, it's just that the frame rate tops out at 30p when you're shooting 4K video. And impressively, the 4K video is full frame, there's no crop, and the camera will shoot either DCI or UHD 4K resolutions. So it shoots the entire frame full width, and then the processor downsamples each line horizontally, and so you're using all of the pixels to make the image. But in the vertical direction, it does use line skipping to reduce resolution. And here's something cool. Just like the XT3, it can output 422 10-bit through the HDMI port to capture with an external recorder, and at the same time record 420 to the internal card. And you can internally, you can record up to 400 megabits per second in all-I mode, and up to 200 megabits per second for standard IPV. And finally, Fuji's log recording can also be done internally to the cards through HDMI or to both simultaneously. I know our own video guy, Jaron, really likes being able to shoot log internally in the cameras, so he'll be happy to see this feature. When it comes to user interface, the top panel has a really cool display on the right-hand side. It looks like a little e-ink display panel, and it can be programmed to show a whole bunch of different settings, and you can also step through the different display modes by pressing a button next to it. Now basically the default mode here is a straightforward basic information display with aperture and shutter speed, ISO, etc. There's also a cool looking sort of virtual dial mode though, where you have shutter speed and ISO displayed by default, or you can set it for aperture or shutter, whatever you like. So when you spin the front and rear control dials on the camera, the little virtual dials on top on the display spin as well. There's also a histogram display, and then after that we're back to the default information display panel. And one really cool thing is that on the left side of the camera there's a mode switch that'll let you quickly switch between still, movie, or hybrid shooting modes. And what's neat about that is that you can have a movie setup and a still setup, and when you switch between them you don't have to fumble around with mechanical dials and buttons to change your settings. This was apparently a frequent complaint from hybrid still and video shooters, and it really works very nicely. It's a great feature. It's very well thought out. And what's more, there's a little sub-panel display on the back of the camera. It's a little 256 by 64 OLED that you can program to display a lot of different things. It's kind of like the touch bar on Apple's MacBooks, except it's not touch sensitive and it's actually useful for things you care about. Let's talk about a couple of basics on the camera. It's got a dual-core processor that we're told is about 4 times more powerful than the one in the 50S or R. And, a little drum roll please, it has dual card slots! It'll take 2 SD cards, and I'm sure that'll make a lot of people happy, or at least it'll keep a lot of people from being upset and flaming Fuji on the internet. Generally, it's a really amazingly light camera too. I was really surprised when I picked it up for the first time. I was expecting it to have a lot more heft to it, but it only weighs about 1.4 kilograms with the EVF attached. Or if you want to really pare things down, if you're flying in a drone or something, you can take off the EVF and that drops another 100 grams off the weight. Like I said, it's really pretty surprising when you pick it up for the first time. Another feature, it has dual batteries in it, so it can go for up to 800 shots on a charge, and it also has USB-C power delivery, so if you have a strong enough power source, basically 30 watts or more, it'll charge both batteries simultaneously. Fujifilm also made a really big deal about how rugged the camera is in their presentations. It's got a 4-part magnesium alloy casting that's just feather light, but really incredibly stiff at the same time. And very interestingly, it has the standard front, back, and top panels you'd find in most any camera. There's also a separate inner panel that's a very interesting development. It must have been the subject of a lot of testing and development within Fujifilm. So basically, I mean, the big feature of this camera is its 100 megapixel resolution. When you've got 100 megapixels, it doesn't take much at all to produce a noticeable blur. And we know from long experience with mirrorless systems over many years now that shutter shock is almost always an issue at some shutter speeds. Basically, shutter shock refers to the fact that when the shutter blades open and slap the bottom of their enclosure, it can send a vibration through the camera body that can produce blur in the images. So Fujifilm's done a couple of things here to reduce that. First, they built in 4 shock absorbers into the shutter assembly itself to give the shutter blades kind of a soft landing. But beyond that, they also use this idea of an inner panel to just really lock together the lens, the body flange, and the IBIS assembly. And then they mount the shutter assembly on either the front or the back panel, and there's some kind of compliant coupling or compliant mounting between the two of them. So it helps keep vibration from the sensor from vibration from the shutter from reaching the sensor. It's a pretty cool design. I've never seen it in the camera before, and it's going to be interesting to get the GFX-100 back into the lab and play around a little bit and see what we can see or not see in terms of shutter shock. And finally, there's a ton of sealing points on the body. There's a total of 95 seals between the body itself and the separate EVF assembly. So this should be a pretty well sealed camera, and we're looking forward to putting it through the ringer back at IR headquarters in our drip tester. And then finally, it's specified down to minus 10 degrees centigrade, but right now, even as I speak, there's a Fuji-sponsored climber using one on an ascent of Mount Everest where the temperatures can apparently hit minus 40 C. So the GFX-100 can probably stand up to whatever you want to throw at it. It seems like it's a pretty rugged, well-built camera. So that's a very quick look at the GFX-100 from Fuji. It's really an impressive camera. We've barely scratched the surface of what there is to talk about in this video. But we'll have a lot more coverage on our site as we go forward, so check the link below and stay tuned, and thanks for watching.